Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Nasser Abdurrahman. I am a faculty fellow here at the Co-working Center. I just want to welcome you all to this, our second installment in our Elements of Border and Infrastructure series. This is a series that's going to be running for the whole academic year, 4 sessions this semester, 4 sessions the next semester. And we're very grateful to have you all with us and to see returning faces and some new ones. It's always nice. I'm going to say a very super brief word about the series and the event today, and then even briefer introductions to our panelists, and we will get started. So Elements of Border and Infrastructure is, like I said, a series of workshops across this year that takes up some of the big questions in the study of borders and infrastructure, but it does so through elements. It does so elementally, right? It tracks earth, water, fire, and air. And for us, the idea of framing it this way, thinking elementally, was to kind of get at certain materialities, forms of mediation, scale, and to really use this sort of elemental framing to think about real continuities. I think material continuities between the border crisis on the one hand and the climate crisis on the other. And today's event is framed around earth or land. And we can get into what that difference marks. And it opens up, on the one hand, a range of what seem like old, but I would say are just persistent questions around ownership, the agrarian, occupation, conquest, persistent forms of colonial politics. And it connects them to, again, what appear like newer questions in conservation or resource management or ecology and greening. And we've asked our participants to think about these connections, and we've asked them to think or mull over a little bit what it means to kind of connect the politics of land to emergent visions of global climate justice, right? So a very small ask, but there you go. To that end, each of our panelists will have they'll speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, okay? And this is, the idea is that it's not a kind of too overly prepared talk. It's a way of setting out some stakes, some questions, some ideas. We will then turn to a kind of conversation between them that I'll try to mediate to a degree. And we'll open it up to general Q&A from the audience, right? You can ask questions anytime through the chat function, or at the Q&A, in the Q&A session, you can use the raise hand function and one of us will call on you. If you prefer to ask a question anonymously, which a lot of people do, that's totally cool. You can DM any one of the hosts that come up in the participants box on the right, and just send us a question and we will relay it. Before I make some very brief introductions, I'm going to get in trouble if I don't plug the rest of the stuff the center is doing. So some events to look out for in the future, in the near future. First of all, the next session in this series coming up on November 3rd, that's about air. We have Sam Dolby, Asher Gertner, and Ayan Assar. It should be great, and I encourage you all to stick with it. Again, these series are meant to be sort of cumulative and building up on each other, so it's great to have a kind of consistent presence. We have an event co-sponsored at BARD this year called Afghanistan 20 Years On. This stuff should be coming up in the chat. I think the links for it. And we have a roundtable on Iranian and Turkish responses to the Afghan refugee crisis tomorrow at 12. Again, the link should come up in the chat. I think I've covered my selling points. So we have with us today 3 really brilliant activists and thinkers. We're very, very lucky to have them with us today. And I'm going to be giving just a lightning brief intro to each of them. It does no justice to their work or their achievements, or indeed their commitments, which are many and deep. And the fuller bios will come up in the chat once they get around to speaking. So I encourage you to have a look at that. But in the meantime, in order of appearance, Bridget Gorashi is an assistant professor of anthropology at Franklin and Marshall College. Caterina Scaramelli is an assistant professor of anthropology at Boston University, and Max Eil is a postdoctoral fellow of rural sociology group at Wageningen University and also a researcher at the Tunisian Observatory for Food Sovereignty and the Environment. So with that, I will hand it over to Bridget and we can take it from there.
Thank you, Nasser, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, James and Jared, for the invitation to be here with you today. Really excited to be here, and the prompt was very productive for me. So I'm going to share my slides. Okay, and oh boy, there we go. Okay, on we go. The problem space of Earth. What can biodiversity conservation in the midst of the Iraq War tell us about the problem space we call Earth? Earth is the totality of the planet as it's distinct from the solar system. When we think about its expanse of lands, the depths of its waters, and its atmosphere below the threshold of outer space. We think of Earth as a total and totalizing environment. In testing to this fact, the concept, the environment, emerged out of a commitment to globalism and the planet following a massive geopolitical reconfiguration after World War II. In the mid-20th century, states created durable political and physical infrastructure to facilitate international cooperation and speed international movement of commodities, from the creation of the United Nations to provide a forum for political cooperation between nation states in the wake of empire, to the emergence of something called the economy, as Tim Mitchell would say, to speed the unencumbered movement of capital around the globe, to the formulation of the biosphere concept, which space exploration made possible. It was the 1968 NASA Apollo Earthrise photograph that gave us the perspective of Earth from outer space and the visual of its planetary fragility. Along with Rachel Carson's attention to industrial pollution, the image motivated the contemporary environmental movement to recuperate Earth from the anthropogenic transformation and the impact of climate change. Recent history suggests that Earth is, and has always been, a political object inseparable from global finance, securitization regimes, and neo-imperial political machinations. Those same regimes of capital, political violence, and environmentalism motivated the US war and UN reconstruction of Iraq. In March 2004, President George W. Bush seized the opportunity to greenwash an ill-founded war by arguing to Congress that he invaded and occupied Iraq because Saddam Hussein drained the marshes and committed genocide against its residents. 4 months later, Saddam Hussein became the first world leader officially removed from office, in part on the basis of environmental crime. Around the same time, Khalil Walid, an administrator at the United Nations Environmental Program in Geneva, flew to Baghdad to establish Iraq's first Ministry of Environment. US war allies and UN officials located the environment in Iraq as a project of war and occupation. The biodiversity conservation of Iraq's marshes became the lead initiative of this environmental movement. After the US invasion, Iraqi exiles returned to the country to establish the NGO I call Green Iraq, a scientific institute with the goal of restoring Iraq's marshes. Zaid Kubra, self-appointed CEO of Green Iraq, started the initiative with $200,000 in seed money from the US Department of State to determine whether reflooding the marshes was feasible. He had been a participant in the department's Future of Iraq project. The panel issued their report on March 20th, 2003, the same day the US invaded Iraq. 3 days later, Kubra organized a press conference to announce the panel's findings, which stated that restoring the marshes was not only plausible, it was warranted. Kubra recalled, so maybe it was fortuitous, maybe it was serendipity, maybe we were manipulated. Who knows? I don't know. It just happened that we came out with the report right when the war was taking place. So there was a huge amount of interest. Birds in the biosphere. Iraq has played a central role in the formation of what we recognize as the biosphere today. In the early 21st century, saving the Earth meant recuperating pinpointed ecologies dense with biodiversity. In environmental science, the extinction premise suggests that not all planetary ecosystems can be saved, but those most critical to the planet must be safeguarded. Under this framework, measuring biodiversity became a key technology in determining which environments demanded conservation. Wetlands were especially important in this regard because they are biodiverse environs that are also home to species of migrating birds who connect habitats across the globe during annual north-south voyages. And there are 9 of these flyways that have been identified. Global environmentalists used birds as indices of ecological value, called indicator species, IUCN, the leading global conservation organization, considered a density of birds equivalent to a density of biodiversity, since only biodiverse ecologies can sustain bird life. Iraq's marshes supported 312 species of migratory birds on their journey across the West Asian, East African flyway from Europe to East Africa, including 2 critically endangered species, the sociable lapwing and the slender-billed curlew. Following Saddam Hussein's draining of the marshlands, so I want to just show you a quick map here where we're talking about. We're talking about southern Iraq, just north of Basra, at the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So following Saddam Hussein's draining of the marshlands in the early 1990s, after a 1991 uprising that began there and nearly deposed him, the marshes had been 220,000 square kilometers. So after draining, they were reduced from a size that was more than twice the present day Everglades to less than 10% of their original expanse. They were near total collapse. A key report in 2001 by the United Nations Environmental Program found that 66 bird species were under direct threat. The Basra reed warbler was critically endangered and could be wiped out entirely. The population of the endangered marbled teal would be cut in half. If the marshlands were not rehabilitated and conserved, conservationists argued, it would set off a worldwide domino effect, impacting migratory bird and animal life across the planet. The loss of Iraq's marshes therefore amounted to a planetary crisis that would imperil the biosphere and demanded immediate attention. At first blush, restoring the marshes and supporting endangered bird life seems like an undeniable benefit for Iraq, and in many ways it was. But what I'm arguing here today is that these relations of care are violent at their core. There is violence in caring for the planet in the context of the Iraq War, because doing so directly endangered the human lives of Iraqi biologists who Kubra deployed to count birds in the marshes. And he did so in order to produce evidence needed for conservation. So traveling to the marshes over active battlefields and deep into the thick of a labyrinthian maze meant that Iraqi biologists faced near certain kidnapping and targeted attacks by militia for their association with the US occupation. Despite these risks, Kubra argued that wetland conservation, quote, had to be now, end quote, in the midst of active battle. He worried that donor dollars would only be available during the war. Anthropologists and historians have well documented the ways in which biodiversity conservation advanced imperial control of territory, beginning with the US settler colonial national parks movement that continues to serve as the model for global biodiversity conservation today. From its inception, the state of Iraq has been a testing ground for biopolitical warfare. In 1920, the British tested out its newly formed Royal Air Force as a means to dominate from the skies when it used the vantage point of the terrestrial atmosphere to squash a ground rebellion in the South. The US expanded experimentation with air power in the first Gulf War through intermittent bombing during sanctions and into the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Saddam Hussein too relied on the power of the skies in the chemical warfare attacks in Kurdistan and elsewhere. During the 1991 and 2003 wars, the US spent 1,200 tons of ammunition in Iraq, which is now decaying in the desert, leaching depleted uranium into the soil and sending cancer and birth defect rates soaring. As the latest instantiation of biopolitical warfare, birding was a less obvious form of violence. Yet birding operationalized environmental justice to establish territorial control and facilitate access to Iraq's ample natural resources in water and oil embedded in the same geological field as the marshlands. When Iraqi biologists conducted ornithological research in the marshes for Green Iraq, they followed BirdLife International and IUCN protocol for establishing biodiverse ecosystems by identifying and then counting endemic, endangered, and migratory birds. Mohammed Sharif was Green Iraq's chief ornithologist. He told me he loved birds from the moment of his birth, when his father gifted him a falcon and attempted to inculcate in him the nobility of following Arabian traditions, his words, like falconry practiced by elites across the Gulf. Sharif was newly released from the Iraqi army just before the US invasion, and he took it hard. He felt like he lost his honor. When his graduate advisor approached him about birding for Green Iraq, Sharif felt like he found a pathway to personal and national redemption via his old love, the birds. However, Green Iraq's donor-driven agenda meant that the NGO hired Sharif to take on the most lethal forms of labor. Primarily, he was kidnapped in the marshes while birding and later threatened at gunpoint in the NGO's Baghdad office by militia associated with the Ministry of Interior. The violence of birding originates with bilateral donor contracts that Kubra signed with the governments of Italy and Canada. The contract stipulated that Kubra needed to spend the majority of funds inside donor states. We're talking upwards of $50 million. Kubra set that amount at 80%. To meet these terms, Kubra hired birding experts from Canada and hydrological engineers from Italy who would draft the marshlands conservation plans. Sharif and his team would collect data these foreign contractors needed to substantiate their plans, but Sharif would not have a say in the design or implementation of marshlands conservation. Instead, his own body became extractivist infrastructure that enabled foreign donors and contractors to formulate plans from afar. Though Sharif experienced his work as liberatory, foreign contractors used his birding expertise instrumentally to strengthen the occupation of his own country. International institutions that sought to protect Iraq's wetlands, animal livelihoods, and its ecologies produced hierarchies of human life that valued foreign lives over and above the lives of Iraqi nationals, thereby terraforming Iraq's marshes with the very hierarchies of life rendered by war. So in closing, I've attempted to show by way of the Iraqi example, what I have attempted to show by way of the Iraqi example is the violence entailed in projects of caring for the earth. In the context of the climate change crisis in the Anthropocene, environmentalist emphasis has been on the violence in the failure to act. But while climate advocates were fighting for corporate accountability, multinationals in Iraq found new frontiers for extraction through their support for biodiversity conservation. You might be wondering, were Iraq's marshes successfully conserved? Well, yes and no. Today, undoubtedly, the marshes have more water and wildlife, including bird life, than they have in many years. At the same time, as a result of Kubra's embrace of big oil multinationals benefited from Iraq's marshlands conservation, thereby intensifying industrial pollution. In Nahran Omar, for example, a village on the outskirts of the Hamar marshes, the skies are a toxic twilight from noxious oil flaring practices. The mayor claims flaring has doubled cancer rates. The Ministry of Health and Environment cannot seem to prevent this crisis. In other areas of the wetlands, the systematic failures of water and sewage treatment facilities means that a toxic stew pours from broken pipes into the Hamar marshes near Chebayesh. Pollution is one dimension of the unseen, unrecognized violent legacy of the Iraq War. Another equally vicious violence is the way in which wartime biopolitics directly used and then wasted Iraqi civilian lives to suit their needs. I have argued that understanding such care for the earth as violence requires an intersectional approach to the analysis of environmentalism, corporate prospecting, and war making. This wartime project to restore Iraq's marshes primarily operated in the abstract by making Iraq's marshes into a political object through international work at conferences and policymaking and in donor-funded initiatives. The biggest effects of marshlands revival, I suggest, were not in the marshes, but in the ways corporate actors, Iraqi exiles, and members of foreign government generated prestige, power, and profit from the conservation exercise. However, Iraqi civilians continue to make lives in the marshes, and documentary filmmakers and ethnographers suggest this has little to do with the political orchestration of conservation. Wetlands also transform the political, as Caterina Scaramelli has so beautifully demonstrated. In 2019, and continuing periodically through present, Iraqi revolutionaries have taken to the streets to demand accountability of government and the end of corruption and contamination. The ability to build a transformative biopolitics equipped to redress the problem of Earth rests in our ability to recognize these demands of state reform as what Regine Sahakian calls an extraction rebellion. Iraqi artist and revolutionary Ali Iyal asserts that this revolutionary work is an effort to build, quote, the other green zone, the green zone of our dreams, of our hopes, end quote. He suggests that climate justice begins with the open reckoning of environmentalism's extractive capacities in making the earth. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
One more slide, sorry. This is the revolutionary slide.
Thank you. Katerina?
Am I next? All right.
Yes.
Can you see my slide? All right. Thank you, Bridget, for this really fantastic presentation. And thank you all so much for the invitation today and for the prompt. Today's event is on Earth, but my research begins with water. So I'm going to start there and trace some of the watery connections to Earth. So just over a decade ago, reforms in the energy and electricity markets in Turkey led to an unprecedented scramble for tapping new sources of hydropower. The country's then prime minister promised that by the Republic's centenary, all of Turkey's rivers would be harnessed for electricity production. And as small and large construction firms hurried to grab run-of-the-river hydropower concessions in particular, residents witnessed rapid environmental impacts on their valleys, mountains, and pastures. And at the time, as a student, I had been interested in the diasporic and migratory movements to and from Turkey's northeastern mountain range in the Kashgar. As urbanites traveled to get together in the mountain yailas, in the pastures in the summer, I had observed they maintained their extended kinship ties rooted in a shared claim of belonging to and rootedness in ancestral lands. And it has only occurred to me recently that this early research interest also overlapped with my own biographical quandaries. So I had left my own hometown in the Italian Alps, my entire family is still there, and I was making sense of what these native mountains and how they might offer venues for cultivating belonging and kinship. This is all to say that land politics is, of course, intimately connected to identity politics and articulations of belonging. But in Turkey's Northeast in 2011, it was impossible to ignore the scarrings of hydropower constructions in the mountainsides, and also the many grassroots mobilizations emerging to challenge run-of-the-river hydropower with lively protests, events, platforms, different kinds of activism kind of across the political spectrum, and also lawsuits, many of them successful and many unsuccessful. And activism followed the migratory movements of rural residents, and it was rooted as much in Ankara and Istanbul as in Hopa and Artvin. Sociologists and anthropologists were there all along, and there is really excellent ethnographic and analytical work on these processes and transformations by sociologists and anthropologists like Sinan Erensu, Özge Yaka, Erdem Evren, Ekin Kurtic, and many others. And activists and ordinary residents wrestling with the possibility, the experience, and the impacts of this construction boom in the mountains articulated claims connecting water to earth, mudslides, eroded mountain slopes, construction debris suffocating beehives and coating vegetable fields, the silence of a river reduced to a trickle, the death of fish, and the role of water in maintaining valley and mountain ecologies and microclimates, and also the social and cultural lives connected to them. As it passes through hydropower turbines, residents explained over and over again, water dies. And this claim was biochemical, was hydrological, ecological, and political at the same time. It was at once material and metaphorical. Water policy and markets are connected to Earth in obvious ways through agricultural production. About half of Turkey's surface is used in agriculture, fields and orchards, livestock pastures, enriched by chemical fertilizer and water through old and new irrigation systems. And the micro and macro politics of irrigations have also been much studied in recent years. While currently only about 20% of Turkey's residents work in agriculture these days, in the 1950s, the share of agricultural employment was around 85%. So these rural roots are really everywhere in everyone's family. And many scholars, of course, have written about the transformation of Turkey's rural economy and the rapid processes of urbanization and industrialization that followed. And anthropologists in the 20th century generally followed agricultural workers as they migrated to the country's growing cities, shunning earlier village ethnography type studies that focus on putatively bounded and traditional rural communities. But these anthropologists have now returned to the countryside. And there is a really good and cutting edge work being done on shifting production regimes and contemporary agricultural labor and technologies, and also on the intersections of gender, class, and ethnicity underpinning this work and this rural life. You can also trace the moral and national stakes of botanical collecting and the future of agriculture by looking at the social lives of seeds stored in the country seed banks. And here I want to plug anthropologist Can Dalyan's excellent work with scientists at the National Seed Bank in Ankara. But water and earth are inseparable in many other ways. So work by scholars like Ekin Kurtic has taught us to connect the large reservoirs of hydropower dams to the ecological infrastructure of the forested slopes around it. A social landscape of abandonment and depopulation, forests growing in former pastures and gardens, harnessed by dam engineers for the work of maintaining forests, turned into infrastructure that will help to reduce sedimentation in the dam's basin, thus prolonging its lifespan. And territorialization and the making of earthy resource frontiers, of course, exceeds water. For example, anthropologist Zeynep Oğuz has written on Turkey's petroleum frontiers, intertwined both with internal warfare and international geopolitics. And this is all, I think, really cutting edge work that analyzes the complex politics of expertise that foregrounds and complicates materiality, and also refuses some of the taken for granted explanations. So as I followed the flows of mountain rivers downstreams, as a friend had at some point urged me to do and abandon the mountains for the plains, water and earth were mixed and in even more complicated ways in this deltaic environments characterized by remaining swamp forests, marshes, brackish lakes, or really what remains of wetland ecologies, all gradually terraformed and repopulated over the past few centuries, and particularly during the 20th century. These patchwork landscapes feature industrial areas, towns, satellite suburbs, fields of commercial agricultural crops, and wetland conservation areas, all side by side. And often the same infrastructure of irrigation is used to sustain the drying and dying marshes. And the institutions charged with preserving the remaining Turkish wetlands are situated within ministries largely charged to drain them. Since scientific work in the 1990s theorizing ecosystem services, wetlands themselves have been recast as natural infrastructures, and they can feature in ecological designs for the climate resilient cities of the future. And this is why I see questions of infrastructure as entangled with and separated from ecology. All right, so where does this leave Earth? Wetland governance has been tightly connected to questions of land and agriculture. At the 1968 technical meeting on wetland conservation in Turkey, in fact, many Turkish officials muse on the potentials of wetland drainage to solve the problem of increasing erosion in agricultural land, for which peasants were to blame. Land reclamation, they suggested, would offer just the perfect solution, creating more agricultural land. And this was, of course, not new, as many environmental historians like Fasal Hussain and Chris Chrétien have documented. Marsh drainage was really key to late Ottoman agriculture and economic policy, on top of being a tool for controlling, resettling and taxing nomadic populations. And in the early Republican period, the drainage of marshes in Turkey, as elsewhere, was interlinked with questions and projects of public health. So this scholarship is really attuned to the hydrological and the ecological specificity and materiality of water environment and their terraforming, and reminds us that many of these terraforming projects failed. But drained land also provided really good places for resettling, exchange, and forcibly resettled populations throughout the 20th century. So in one of my old field sites in the Conserved Delta, I visited an eerily empty neighborhood of standard brick houses and barns built by the city of Bafra to accommodate a community of resettled Bulgarians in 1951. And nearby, as a local geographer has documented, the residents of a village that was drowned in the making of one of the large hydropower dams on the Conserved River, and these residents were themselves the descendants of exchanged Balkan populations just a generation before, were resettled in the 1980s to the newly drained Lake Amek in the southeast of Turkey, where they found cultivation to be hardly possible in these newly reclaimed lands. So this is a remaking of land and water that's really concurrent with the remaking of Turkishness, but also rife with resistance, with failures, and with the potential for staging all sorts of political and moral claims. So in my own work, I focus on claims of what I've called moral ecology. These are aspirations for cultural and political forms and futures that are inextricably linked to ecological relations. And the key for me, in this approach, is to not consider these ecological relations as merely blank slates or simple proxies for human meaning making or politics, and nor to render them ahistorical. However, of course, and as Brigitte Guarachi has so vividly reminded us just now, a moral ecology is not necessarily one of resistance or liberation, but can well be and has often been oppressive and violent. And I'd like to talk about that in the Q&A. So to return to Earth, I wanted to suggest that a framework of moral ecology can help us center some of the affective stakes and the non-utilitarian values that underlie complex resource politics and its geopolitics, and also can help us foreground some of the complex interconnections of living organisms and non-living materials where it unfolds. This is all from me. Thank you so much. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Katarina. I'm gonna turn it over to Max.
Fantastic. So thank you so much for both of these presentations. I learned a lot, and thank you to the organizers for putting this together. Questions of land and ecology in the Arab region are like and unlike what I think we can identify following the name of the journal founded by Sam Moyo, the great scholar of Zimbabwe, Africa, and third world agriculture as the Agrarian South. They are similar in that, like so much of the third world, Arab countries have faced successive waves of colonialism and neo-colonialism at the hands of Europe and the United States. And they are like in that the national liberation question, or sovereign control over the national productive resources towards people-centered planning, has been an often shared and equally often frustrated horizon. They are to some extent in our moment, unlike other portions of the world, not because of scare words like terrorism, Islam, or authoritarianism, but rather because the global shares of wealth to be secured from oil have meant that the region is now subject to an unusual degree of external aggression and warfare. I want to connect now two countries, which partially by coincidence, partially by networking, partially by life, I have learned a little bit or a lot about paths not taken in water management and accordingly landscape management, and in which I have been politically invested in contemporary efforts towards supporting food sovereignty and circulating around the agrarian and national questions, that is Tunisia and Yemen. Tunisia and Yemen, or the two Yemens, have had rather distinct state-building trajectories. Tunisia, as a so-called republic, was born after the French and the right wing of the national movement under Habib Bourguiba conspired to destroy the pastoralist and peasant-based Yusufite wing of the movement oriented towards Arab nationalism. The result was a pacted decolonization, fully aligned with the Western states, despite the presence of a combative, well-organized, but infeudated with the Western trade union, the UGTT. Yemen, in contrast, as is well known, was split north and south, the south coming under the control of an openly Marxist government, the north ruled by royalists. In North Yemen and Tunisia alike, peasants lacked effective incorporation in the state and its development programs and were marginalized by those development projects. By the 1970s, the trajectories started to look more and more alike. Tunisia, under the firm guidance of Western-aligned, Western-trained technocrats entranced by modernization ideology, disdainful of what they called traditional forms of agriculture and its associated infrastructure for land management, poured nearly half the state budget into mega dams, with little to no state investment and research and development into the dazzling array of Tunisian microhydraulics, the Jisr, the Tabia, and the check dams, which enabled apricots and pomegranates to grow in areas not so distant in annual precipitation from that which fell upon the Sahara. Meanwhile, the overall capital-intensive development model, including the aggressive Western-pushed industrialization of agriculture, led to a massive outmigration of laborers from Tunisia to Libya and France. In fact, by 1967, a deliberate state developmental policy. Similarly, in the west coast of Yemen, state investment in absurdly expensive hydraulics and widespread neglect of terrace agriculture undermined smallholders and accelerated rural differentiation and set the stage for rural outmigration. In both countries, in both Tunisia and North Yemen, patterns of state investment encouraged by the West were often saw money invested in those projects recycled through study plans, contractors, engineering firms, overall favoring the wealthy, and perhaps most subtly, and perhaps most destructively, pushing the countries onto capital-intensive rather than labor-intensive forms of resource mobilization based on path-dependent patterns of technological infrastructure. The social consequence was the alchemization of these workforces into a floating proletariat. On the one hand, of course, suppressing worldwide wages on the world systemic level, locally providing the capital through remittances for petroleum-fueled wells, which would destroy national water tables and focus productive resources on ever larger amounts of fruit and vegetables, which occupy ever larger portions of the productive lands. This is also where we can see the interweaving of Tunisian and Yemen developmental patterns with the rise of fossil capital as a worldwide system, given that these capital flows and the labor flows that were their source were in fact dependent on specific patterns of capitalist development or of oil fuel development in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Libya, and of course, France. In consequence, both Tunisia and also Yemen became increasingly dependent on cereal imports to feed their peoples. Each from 1970 onwards faced rising gaps between local cereal production and total cereal needs, as cheap and subsidized wheat, primarily from the settler lands of the US, systematically undermined local production. In both countries, although I know the story far, far better in Tunisia, throughout the 1970s and 1980s, alternative plans were also put forward. That is, a path not taken now in internal developmental planning that would have proceeded along a very different pattern. They would have improved on local hydraulics, worked against differentiation, worked towards social well-being of the poorest in the country, and worked towards irrigation styles, which would have nestled farming into the ecology. Indeed, in Tunisia, this project advanced remarkably, in part under the aegis of UNESCO, in part under the aegis of leftists who had escaped the Bourguibist repression of the 1960s, where the Tunisian agronomists, Slahdin al-Amami, alongside colleagues at their independent, although government-funded research center, developed technologies and research programs specifically oriented around irrigation that were oriented towards the maximum mobilization of domestic labor, then of course, often serving to suppress domestic wages to constitute a surplus army. These plans would have preserved the water cycle, systematically recharged reservoirs, and mobilized both labor and furthermore abundant resources like stone and earth to safeguard what the Indian economist Archana Prasad calls socially necessary nature. These plans, like those of Yemen, attentive to ecological concerns with an almost unbelievable prescience, drawing in Tunisia at least on Samir Amin's dependency theory and focused above all on seizing the outward flow of surplus, were a dead letter under the iron grip of the US-aligned dictator Habib Bourguiba. The failure to keep the national question in view and politics in command, and the suppression of the nationalist wing of the national movement in Tunisia have been, of course, one factor leading to this outcome. By the 1990s, amidst ascendant neoliberalism, earlier processes only accelerated, giving rise to, and I don't want to say causing, the social explosions, which came to be called here the Arab Spring. In many ways, through its increasing reliance on international loans, Tunisian sovereignty had become, even or especially post-2011, increasingly hollowed out as post-uprising governments lacked programmatic coherence, social support, or any clear ideological vision around national development policy. Meanwhile, food import needs grow yearly. In Yemen, meanwhile, facing increasingly devastating water shortages and in a developing US-orchestrated war, the sovereignty deficit is even more acute. The country is under a foreign military occupation and is in effect fighting a war of national liberation. Where does that bring us, or where does that take us? In fact, amidst this catastrophe, and again, rather unknown in the West, the government in Sana'a is increasingly interested in a national food security strategy, which looks more and more like food sovereignty. Furthermore, the struggle in Yemen itself is fundamentally one of sovereignty over land, the national productive forces, and liberating the forces of production from the forces of disorder, which are contesting that sovereignty. In Tunisia, meanwhile, more and more activists are interested in food sovereignty as a component of and cornerstone of a renewed national sovereignty, which was in fact embedded in the post-revolutionary constitution. Indeed, in Tunisia, one part of the revolution itself, almost completely unknown outside of the example of Jemna, were large-scale land occupations across the country of formerly colonial land, which was enveloped by the neo-colonial state from 1956 to 1970. How then does that invite us to consider, on the one hand, the imbrication of climate and land politics, and on the other, our understanding of the future of climate and land politics in the region and more broadly? That answer, I think, is tragically more opaque than one would like. Clearly, there is a legacy of interest in permanently sustainable land management technologies towards maximizing domestic agricultural surplus in both countries. Clearly, there is a legacy of intense intellectual investigation precisely into this topic, a legacy which ought to be and desperately needs to be excavated and updated for contemporary understanding and programmatic purposes. But of course, this leaves to the side a question which goes beyond technical issues and extends into political issues, and which extends beyond agriculture. It therefore brings into view what Moyo, Paris Yaros, and Praveen Jha call the classical agrarian question, which remains the pillar of all further struggles, and whose advance depends on the defense of the political conquests of the past. What that will look like remains to be seen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Max. And thank you all three of you for those very provocative and rich presentations. So we're going to move to something like a kind of conversation between the three of you, and I'm going to maybe throw out just a couple of half-baked questions that came to me listening to this, and maybe they can, kickstart a conversation around a few points. And I'll just tell the audience that, you can, I think Jim has mentioned in the chat, but you can ask questions in the chat box, like I mentioned earlier, and you can use the raise hand function in a little while. So that was incredibly insightful. And I think the first thing I want to kind of just throw out there is about the way nature, and I would say nature as wilderness, appears in your work, and whether we can connect that, because what kept on coming to me listening to you is how that connects to, I think, race, basically constructs of race or mechanisms of racialization. And it seems to me that these constructs of nature, or of nature as wilderness especially, seem to rely on a kind of emptying of nature from its human life forms, or specifically its racialized human life forms, right? It's like going back to a certain conservation of nature or of what gets constructed as the wilderness has to come at the expense of those racialized or colonized subjects that have been misusing it so far. And in a way, you can see a kind of resonance between green movements, even on the left, and sort of wider imperial politics, in which, this kind of back to nature, conservation, let's green it all, relies on this kind of sometimes hidden, sometimes not so hidden racial taxonomy, right? And I was just reminded of this line that I read a few days ago in Patrick Wolf's book called Traces of History. It's a book about racialization, and he has this remark where he says, there is no such thing as wilderness, only depopulation. So he connects that kind of the construct of wilderness to a much older settler colonial sort of impulse. So that's my first question. How can we link? And it goes to the question of violence and moral ecology. What underpins it in terms? Does anything like race or racialization underpin it, and how? The second thing I would throw out there is just how struck I am, coming in part from urban studies, how struck I am by the return of certain terms, or terms that people in my neck of the woods with an obvious urban bias have ignored or displaced entirely, most chiefly among them the rural, in which all of your work sort of gets at a kind of return to the rural, right? But also the bigger political sort of historical questions connected to that, the agrarian question or the question of national liberation. One way that has come back in sort of colonial studies is through the question of land and, a certain critique of land and land as property. But there seems to be something else going on with the rural, right? As on one hand, an analytic, a kind of diagnostic, but also an ethic, some like a research ethic or a political ethic, which I think I'd love to hear more about. And how you see that kind of connect to a politics, basically, right? A wider politics. Does do a kind of a politics around climate justice, around stuff like decolonization, require not just a kind of return to land, right, or the land question, which we kind of know, but they require a kind of return to the rural which then opens up agriculture, the agrarian, and everything that kind of travels under that. So I will leave it at that. But I mean, you have to pick. You can pick up on those. You don't have to. It's just we can go around and you can comment. I don't know who wants to go first. I'm not going to call anyone, so you just have to kind of jump in and volunteer.
You have to call on. It's the academic.
I don't play the role of authority very well at all. I mean, I'm a kind of failed teacher in that respect. But okay.
I'm happy to go first and get us started. And thank you for this fantastic questions. And I guess we'll have to extend the event for another 10 hours before we have a chance to fully discuss them and debate them amongst ourselves and with the audience. But I think what you bring up about the question of wilderness is really important, and particularly given the kind of strong European, North American history of the concept and how it was applied and the particular kind of ideas underpinning it. I think the three of us probably encounter versions of the concept of wilderness that aren't just the same. So for example, in the Turkish context, I think the discourse on nature, which yes, it's a process of purification, and yes, it has to do with population displacement, and yes, with the kind of time travel to this idyllic past, and yet it's often already populated with people. And so in my own work, I've noticed a kind of recurrent image, if anything, of the pastoral or some like rural idyllic past, right? That various wetland conservation projects were returning to. So these are landscapes where like the water buffaloes and feral horses are considered to be by many environmental advocates part and parcel of the landscape because of this recognition that the landscapes had been cultivated for a long time and had been inhabited. Now, the question of who inhabited them, right? That's a different story, because of course, this history of the rural idyllic past make and remake population histories and, erase accounts of population and livelihood on top of the, actual physical violent displacement of those populations. So that's been interesting for me to kind of think about in my own work. What is the extent to which the William Cronon type critique of the wilderness as a cultural idea, what do you do with that in a context that's not the United States? And I just wanted to say, and I really want to hear both of you kind of engage with that as well. But I was a reluctant, rural anthropologist. I had come to this work, wanted to do a study of the politics of expertise. I was interested in like experts and how their expertise is instrumentalized, right, for wider projects, and the kind of things that happens within that, how violent ideas turn out to have some liberatory outcome, and liberatory projects turn out to be violence, and that really interested me. And I ended up doing a village ethnography for part of my work because my interlocutors called me out because I was not engaging with farmers. And that was just because of my own, the rural has been done, and village ethnography is a thing of the past, kind of prejudice. So it's been interesting to kind of have been kind of pulled into the rural. And a question I have for both of you, Max and Bridget, is actually building on that. What was like an unexpected turn that your research took just as you encountered some of the kind of big ideas and concepts you were working with, and what were some archival or personal encounters that completely kind of shifted your kind of course of research and your thinking?
Katerina, that's a great question. I'm gonna have to think about that for a second as I try to take on Nasser's prompts. So yeah, I think absolutely. These three things are intimately connected: nature, the concept of race, and the concept of rurality. And that's because we, typically think of nature as this space that's, rural, amodern, primitive, pure, completely, we don't often think of human life when we think of nature, or if we do, we think of it as this kind of primordial being. And these are all the sort of ways that the marshes became this kind of diminutive image that represented the occupation. And I want to be careful here because this is one modality of representation of the marshes. There are many, and there have been, and that is a very rich history. So, but to sort of address your point about how these dimensions of environmentalism in and around the marshes were taken up in part of the war project, I think you're really hitting something right on the head here when you're bringing these dimensions together, because the marshes became a political object because they are a rural space, because they have a population that lives on these floating reed-made islands, that Thesiger had written a book, like out of the British imperial period. I mean, the imperial sort of reinvention of tradition is a big part of the way that we see and think about the marshes continuing today. There was a piece in the New York Times that was recently published in the spring of 2021 that uses these tropes over and over and over again. And we know, of course, that this is ahistorical. There's an anthropologist, S.M. Salim, who published his dissertation about the ways that the marshes are and have been historically a driver of Iraq's economy, and are not this ahistorical, disconnected place. So what we're really seeing here, in order to make the marshes an environmental object, is the refusal of history and the willful, not just neglect, but like the willfulness to unsee, to unknow counter narratives that are firmly established in the historical record and even reported in mainstream media. Even the same media sources that are reporting the Marshes story as this, primordial space of nature are also reporting the ways that that space is connected through trafficking over international borders, through religious pilgrimage across international borders, through the development of or the not development, that's a terrible word to use in this context, thinking about Max's work here, but the prosperity of a fishing economy. So thank you for these questions. I think about them a lot. Some of my new work, takes that question of race and geology and the cultures of energy on directly. But that comes out of these questions that I had about, well, at the same time that we see the marshes grow as this political object because of these modes of representation, simultaneously, we're seeing a process of racialization with Iraqi scientists whose expertise is systematically dismantled so that it doesn't carry the same authority as the international experts who are coming into Iraq to formulate their own expert plans for how the marshes should be used. And that to me is a process of racialization. I really wanted to take that on in the book. I do to a certain extent, but I want to take that on even more directly because I think that's really fundamental to how we examine this, these extractive processes that are driving the climate change era, because I think it's completely, they're imbricated.
Max?
All right, so I'll take a stab at some of these. Thank you for those comments and thank you for the additional questions. Although now I have a few too many questions, I can't quite keep track of all of them, but I'm going to try. In terms of nature and race, something that is always worth keeping in mind with these discussions is, even you go back to John Locke, he knew very well the Americas were inhabited by people doing certain kinds of production and so forth. I mean, people were racist, of course, but they weren't total idiots and they didn't have actual blindfolds on, right? They saw what was in front of them, but they didn't deem it suitable for the type of project that they wanted to carry out, which was fundamentally about primitive accumulation, right? I mean, it was justification. And they were correct, right? It wasn't amenable to primitive accumulation. So I think, this is kind of how we, I don't want to delve into the French narratives of Tunisia because this is a little far afield, but I think it's stark how the Bourguibus project, which was really a neo-colonial project in embryo, right, very much refused. It identified modernization as the installation in Tunisia of a social, technological, cultural infrastructure, which looked like that of France. And what that meant was that there was a systematic turning away at the top levels of government from any sort of interest in these forms of life that were illegible and so-called traditional, even if they were actually the common vernacular for a different form of development that Tunisia was never actually able to embark upon, right? So they could not see pastoralism as something that should have been invested in and encouraged in order to actually make people's lives better where they are. They wanted to sedentarize people and then get them into cities, basically. And it was similar with the irrigation technologies. They couldn't see any merit in these labor-intensive technologies. And so one problem kind of catapulted boomeranged into another, right? They didn't see the utility of labor-intensive technologies, thinking that they were associated with tradition and they wanted modernity, and trying to install modernity, they suddenly had 40% unemployment in 1968, right? Which could only be allayed through kind of further neo-colonial dependence on US cereal exports, thereby further making country permanently dependent on US technological infrastructure and so forth in the rural sector. So this again, because they turned away from barley and hard wheat and so forth. Now, I think this is actually intimately connected to this question of both how to connect the rural and the urban, and also what I found that was unexpected in my research. And in terms of how to connect the rural and the urban, you know, Slahdina Lamani was very influenced by Maoism. And Maoism is a development strategy. It was about balancing the rural and the urban in as a holistic national level development strategy. And in fact, you can find worry about this in even the right wing of Tunisia. They didn't know what to do about the bidonville surrounding the cities. They didn't know what to do about these slum belts. Sometimes they actually tried to send people back from the slums into the countryside. But they didn't have any real idea of, say, agrarian reform. So of course it couldn't go anywhere, right? It was a foolhardy enterprise. But Amami was thinking, okay, how could the so-called traditional countryside, its technological inheritance, be the basis for a very different rural-urban balanced development strategy that would systematically stanch the outflow of population from the countryside to the city, which was inevitability under that development strategy. Now, in terms of my research, this so this stuff is kind of a side project. This was not my research at all, what I'm talking about in terms of most of the things. My project was supposed to be about price setting in Tunisia. It's a planned economy and how they used prices to engineer production. But in fact, I went to Tunisia, and first, no one was interested in that. Second of all, no one would give me anything whatsoever about how to engineer prices. They said, well, that's a nice piece of paper you have. Like, we're not giving you any information. And then this is a common occurrence, I think. I mean, third of all, my friends there, like Habib Ayab, Karina Mullen, Brahim Rama, were like, oh, well, what about the Yusufites? And I said, oh, that's an interesting thing. What about the Yusufites? Okay. And I realized that there's actually, there was destruction of the national, Arab nationalist question and movement that had actually been reflected in state historiography, and in turn had been reproduced in a lot of the Western historiography of Tunisia, kind of brushed under the table, essentially, when in fact, this is really where you can find the beginnings of the lack of attention to the rural question. I mean, so this is not to say that Nasserism, for example, was some project of perfect rural-urban balance, but there was relatively more attention to rural questions under Nasserism and in the Algerian revolution and Algerian state planning. These had their huge flaws in their projects, but if we're talking comparatively, there was much more attention to how to accommodate the social needs of rural people in these Arab nationalist projects. So that's one thing. I said, okay, I actually have to write that history. So that's what my current project is, actually writing that history. It's not going very well because I got distracted by writing about climate. And then the other project that I'm working on is an intellectual history of Salahuddin al-Amami and his work, because this is actually one of the most interesting, in my opinion, maybe, I hope, at least important development planners in the post-colonial Arab world, especially as it relates to climate, agriculture, small-scale rural development. And the tragedy is, I mean, of course, he's unknown in the West. He's also not so known in Tunisia itself, when actually these ideas are the potential for a serious development path for Tunisia and probably the Arab region and periphery as a whole. Sorry that went on too long, but these questions had a lot.
No, not at all.
Had big answers.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'd love to hear more about it all, especially this intellectual history. I just want to remind people that they can put questions into the chat box or raise their hand. I don't know if Jim, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I got one. If we have nothing else cooking at the moment, I haven't received any direct messages. I don't know if you have.
Go for it.
Thank you guys all for these really fantastic and thought-provoking presentations, and I love how we're continuing to build synergy across the presentations, bringing in Ekin Kurtic's work, who was presenting in their previous event in the series. I was really struck by something, Bridget, you said in your response to Nasser's question about the rural being idealized as an amodernist, use the word amodernist space. And of course you were right in pointing out that the rural had been, a driver of, economy and political economy in Iraq, as it's been many other places in the Middle East, and that we've sort of forgotten that history in creating this idealism. But what I was also struck by, or what it reminded me of, is that actually the way of thinking of the rural as a modernist is new. Like, going back historically, the rural has been a site, a discursive figure, a symbol of high modernist forms of politics and government. I mean, how many photographs of like Stalin and Khrushchev are there in a field of wheat? Katerina knows well how much the rural figured in Turkish conceptions of modernization, of authoritarian development in the middle part of the 20th century. And I was just really struck by that, and I wondered if any of you had any comment on when that change really occurred, what phenomena brings about this change. I mean, is it something, do we draw this back to Rachel Carson? Is this an import from elsewhere, or how do we square that disjuncture in the way that we think about the rural?
Yeah, thanks, James, for that question. It gives me the opportunity to talk about the historic, like the ways in which the area that the marshes occupy have been tied to every successive wave of Iraqi statecraft since the inception of the state itself, and also to shifting ideas of what Eden, which has now become part of the way that people talk about this space as a modern, like in a positive environmental sense, imagining the sort of lush hanging gardens of Eden, we're going to recreate that. And of course, that is a very Catholic idea. But, at the end of the Ottoman era, the Ottomans, who were very concerned about the hinterlands of their empire, being the marshes, were in the forefront of that, had commissioned a British officer, William Wilcox, to come in and develop a plan for reestablishing the agrarian economy of Iraq by redeveloping the marshes and using the waters from the marshes to irrigate the fields adjacent to them, thereby reestablishing Eden and the Fertile Crescent. And those ideas were very connected to agricultural prosperity in an industrial sense. They were going to restart the industrial production of agriculture in Iraq, thereby making Iraq like the rightful global power that it was as an agrarian producer. And those plans then became they were the first plans for draining the marshes, and the British then built upon them when they came in the mid 20th century, and sort of had this idea again of reestablishing agriculture in the area, and thinking about the rural space of the marshes as very central to that kind of agrarian production. And we see that continuing under Saddam Hussein, right up until the early 90s, when we have a sort of sea change moment when Saddam Hussein decides to drain the marshes entirely, partly as a result of directly as a result of the uprising that occurred there and that nearly deposed him. And that was also encouraged by, there's a bigger history here that America is tied to, that the US is tied to, because of course it was George Bush Sr. that had leafleted that area and encouraged that uprising, and then his son, who decides to go to war in the country and then repurposes that same area as a way to re-message his very unpopular war. And I think for me, like, part of my work has been about documenting what the concept of the environment did in Iraq, like how did it enter Iraq? And the ideas about rurality and like how to reappropriate that space of the marshes didn't begin at in 2003. It was Thesiger's idea that that he published in the 1950s. He had a coterie of British elites, men who followed him into the marshes and published their own books. And then those narratives were repurposed by Iraqi exiles who were trying to make a persuasive argument to the US government about why we should restore the marshes. And that's when you start to see the sort of synergy between these imperial ideas about rural space in Iraq and the war in Iraq itself. To me, that's when the moment of environmentalism happens in Iraq.
Yeah, and I'd like to jump in and thank you for this, Bridget. It's really wonderful to think with, and I don't have. I wish I could have the time to respond to each of the strands of thought that you bring out. But I've been reflecting on the extent to which the wetland is rural or urban. And one conversation I had at some point in my field work with an agricultural engineer, in fact, and she said, well, I was raised in the village, and we used to, go to the city to buy bread for a special occasion. And now I live in the city, and we go to the village to buy bread. And it's like, why can't I ever be in the place where I can just eat my bread and that be like good? And she was reflecting on that kind of phenomenon, right? The like re-emergence in the contemporary moment of the rural as a place for romance and nostalgia and health. But these boundaries over and over again, I mean, I see it with my work on the wetlands, but I don't think you need to work on wetlands in Turkey to do that. It's like the boundary of like clean and dirty and pure and impure and knowledge and ignorance and sacred and profane and innovation and tradition, where like the move between rural and urban kind of over and over again, kind of inverted. So people sometimes even in the breath of the same sentence can argue that the rural is a space of innovation, but then really, it's also a space of tradition, and it's clean, but also really dirty, that it's new and also really old. And I've been kind of fascinated by that. I think it's a kind of a moral boundary making, right? And of course, we know that the rural and the urban make themselves, right? Through remittances, through political economy, through infrastructure. But the kind of discursive aspect, I think is really important, and should be kind of for granted, particularly since it is implicated in the political economy aspect of it, and it is implicated in the infrastructural intermingling as well. So, yeah, I mean, I'll just let Max and Bridget speak more to that, or if you have any more questions for us, maybe from the audience.
Max, do you want to jump in with something here?
I would just very briefly say, I mean, one of the funny things about Tunisia is that Ben Salah and Bourguiba didn't know anything about the countryside at all. And yet they knew this was also the only possible source for national wealth towards any form of industrialization, or however they conceived development, which was not the same. And at some level had meritorious aspects on the part of Ben Salah. Yet they didn't understand the countryside at all, in the least, even though they were both, of course, from the countryside at some level, from small towns that were intimately connected to the countryside. It's impossible almost to have anything else in Tunisia of the 1940s and 1950s. You couldn't have anything else. And Bourguiba actually did make some decent statements in the 30s about the famine and the destruction of olive production Depression era Tunisia, but they had no sense of how to actually carry out a popular development strategy, and so it would just kind of, they were like, okay, well, we'll try this, and these were, their ideas were doomed to fail precisely because they had no understanding of what they were doing whatsoever. They were kind of set out these development programs of ripping up cacti in the Tunisian center of the country and then someone had to explain to them that no, actually those were necessary windbreaks, they were fodder, they also produced fruit, they were necessary for construction materials, They also marked out property lines. In fact, they had a million things that they were doing. They were carrying out a very clear social ecological role in the regulation of all kinds of things. And they were just like starting to rip them up for a period of time until someone not from Tunisia, but actually an international development attaché was like, this is really probably not a good idea to rip these things up. They were, well, okay, maybe we'll stop that program. So it's things like this, right? They had no idea what on earth they were doing. This is kind of like the tragedy of Tunisian development during this period, and really accounts for, I think, for large portions of why it ended up the way it did.
I think our audience is a little bit shy, so we're just gonna keep ad-libbing here. But I mean, there's so much, but I wanted to throw out maybe just another like slightly naive prompt or question, just because I'm guilty of not really thinking about these constructs of the rural in overly critical ways. So I'm genuinely curious about it all, and maybe in terms of our own modes of representation, right? Our own politics, our own writing, our own activism, beyond a very strictly sort of academic mode, right? What we think and what we project. How do you in your work, how do we generally get past these sort of representational binds that you've all thrown up here, right? The rural as this sort of foil of the urban, which doesn't really make sense, but the rural either as this romanticized green eco space that we've all agreed has this incredibly sort of racist and colonial underpinning, or the rural as the traditional, the backward, the obscurantist, all the stuff that if you tell people about a return to the rural today or a return to the agrarian question, it's especially in the West, it's almost like you're speaking anachronistically, right? It's like people don't want to give up on technologies and modernizations, and all the images we have of our future are incredibly urbanized and incredibly technicized. So and so far as there's a question there, how do we think about the rural as beyond the kind of space of projection, but as forms of actually existing life that one has to think about as real life that may need to be strengthened, that may need to be protected, whatever. But how do you get past that kind of representational question, if that makes sense?
This is where I think Katerina does a really wonderful job. So I'm going to just say that you should answer this question.
Well, I don't know if thank you. You're really kind, Bridget. I don't know if I should answer the question, but I just want to throw out there. I remember like early in my research, I was talking with a professor of architecture and was interviewing him because he was doing ecosystem service analysis in the Gediz Delta. And that was pretty like at the forefront of wetland scholarship in Turkey at the time. It hadn't been done much at all. So I was trying to explain to him what my project was. And so I tried basically say like, look, I look at wetland conservation, but like I see it as kind of more similar to agricultural production, so like, and not, I'm not taking it for granted. I'm really like trying to use some of the paradigms of like production and extraction, and see wetland conservation as just like a form of that. Like you're cultivating wetlands, you're extracting value, tangible and intangible, in like monetary forms, and through like power, and through the like moral stake that you may see in the certain kind of like ecological arrangement that you're actually designing and cultivating. And it was kind of fumbling there, but then of course talking with designers and urban planners in Izmir, and there was a group that's really excited about thinking of wetlands, infrastructural capacity, and creating wetlands in the city, and also seeing the Gediz Delta as like an infrastructural buffer to protect Izmir from climate change, while also allowing the city to expand there as needed. Of course, everyone calling for like planning and design, so kind of planning emerging as this like technocratic solution to a social problem over and over again. And so I think this has been how I think I never used the term rural unless I write about people who use it. But thinking about the process of kind of curation and extraction and cultivation and what these processes are and what their histories are, I think can help us kind of move away from a presumed entity of the rural, kind of beyond how people may use it in their politics or discourses. Yeah, Max or Bridget.
Yeah.
Can I respond to Katerina? Or do you want to go, Max?
You can go.
Okay, because as Katerina was speaking, I had this thought about like, well, what is it that makes wetlands this, sort of like, what is it about wetlands that makes it this space that can be appropriated or that can be used to harness power and capital and other kinds of, strategy for territorial control? Is it that they have water? Is it that they have this sort of mystique about what they are because they're impenetrable and you have to have some kind of specialized knowledge of being able to get around them, even to find your way out of them? Is it because they are considered to be this sort of a priori ecological space? And so I was just thinking about like, what are the resources that make that particular construct of a wetland the sort of what we've called like a boundary object or a hyper object, like the specific locus of power that it has. And I also, Max, see these sort of questions that you're engaging too, in terms of like, what are the resources that mobilize these sort of discourses of development and different discourses of territorial control in Tunisia and also in Yemen?
Yeah, so I guess I would approach this from a bit of a distinct angle. Actually, is reflecting in part a rather unfortunate polemic. I just recently wrote something related to these plans for what's called compulsory veganism. I wrote it with the evolutionary biologist and environmental biologist Rob Wallace, who's done the best work on the industrial agricultural origins of COVID. He's fiercely against industrial agriculture and animal agriculture, as am I. And one of the targets of the polemic is an individual who's soon publishing a book with Verso Press, a leftist press of great distinction and regard, that's calling for the removal of half the population of the planet into cities, I guess, and compulsory veganism. There's 300 to 500 million people in the world who live between 5 and 100% of their social reproduction comes from animal raising. Now, occasionally, and I apologize in advance for this, but sometimes I do think that as academics, we're a little guilty of the sin of politesse and overthinking. And we just need to pause and be like, and ask people, well, what are you going to do with those hundreds of millions of people? Have you been to the slums of any third world city? Are there jobs for people there? Like, no, all the people there are hungry and are living in poverty. And you want to displace these people who are somewhere else and have a means of production, who don't want to be displaced and actually are in political struggle to stay where they are and make their lives better. And so and then people are asking, well, maybe they don't really mean to displace them. Maybe we should ask them what they mean. And it's like, whoa, I don't know. I'm reminded of this Ursula Le Guin, I always mispronounce it, Always Coming Home, which had its issues, but she's writing a kind of auto-ethnography of an imagined world where the indigenous civilization of the Pacific coast somehow comes back. And one of the questions is, when people commit absolutely horrific crimes within that civilization, the conception is that people had their heads on wrong. That's her quotation. And I'm kind of like, okay, it was very important. We are very rigorous in our knowledge production. That's how I know about this 300 to 500 million, and be very rigorous about our knowledge production. But if someone can't hear it, maybe they have their head on wrong. And we can maybe just point that out. And if, a very fancy leftist publisher whose books are sitting on the bookshelf, I think I see one in the background of Nasser, maybe a few of them. And, you know, it's like, do they have their head on wrong when they're publishing it? I mean, I'm sorry to be polemical, and but I just like, I don't quite know how to confront this issue, right? Through you run a risk of an over intellectualizing a debate that it's just like kind of passed beyond the stage of reason. But it's not really an answer to the question. It's actually more of a frustration about representation, right? We're unable to make reality visible and most rural people's lives visible to people. This is just wild. I don't know what to do about it. So in fact, it brings us back to where we started, but I just wanted to interject my own experience with it.
I think we're going to pick up on that. I think we're going to stop the recording, and then Max, you're going to have to name the individual that you're talking about, because you're not going to get away with it.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, on that note, I want to thank you all again, and I want to thank all of our audience, and we're going to turn off the recording in a minute. And as a reminder, it will all be up on YouTube very shortly. So thank you all.